Pakistani restaurant last night. It was sort of a dinner meeting, and they were discussing drones because everyone in Pakistan now is horrified and angry at the United States military because of the Obama administration's decision to use drones as one of their main weapons of choice in order against what they call insurgencies, against guerrilla wars, against anybody who's fighting against the empire. And I bring this up in this talk because, in a way, drones are the answer of the military to the problem that they had with GI resistance. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch because it also represents the trend in imperialist industry and to replace labor with machines. So that's why I wanted to start off this talk. Of course, this talk it's done in honor of Max Watts, who devoted his life to what he called RIDA, resistance inside the army. Perhaps devoting his life is the wrong way to put it, but it certainly was a major part of his political contribution to the last half of the 20th century and the first 10 years of the 21st century, was to keep alive the idea of GI resistance. I had a contact with Max starting in either late 1967 or sometime during 1968. Between 1967 and 1971, I was one of the key civilian organizers in what we call the American Servicemen's Union, an attempt to form a union within the U.S. military that was opposed to the war in Vietnam, opposed to racism, and which organized the rank and file GIs against the privileges of the officers in order to take control of their lives. And really, we had a political view of this. I was in Workers' World Party, and we had a view of the army as the state, as Marxists learned from what happened in the Paris Commune, that in order for the working class, in order for the oppressed to take control of society, they couldn't just take over the instruments that were being used to rule them. They had to actually smash them. The first experience was with the Paris Commune. So we looked upon the army as the essence of the state. In a way, these days, the armies of the Pentagon and NATO are the state apparatus of the imperialist bourgeoisie, of the 1% who rule the world. And so we looked at it that way. And the army also, as part of class society, reflected the classes in society. So, more or less, there was an analogy between the ordinary soldiers, the privates and Spec 4s, Spec 5s, and the working class, whereas the non-commissioned officers were like the four men, the four people at the supervisors at the factory, and the officers, even the junior officers in an imperialist army like the United States, and of course the senior officers were more linked up with the ruling class and with the managers of society. And so when we organized not only against the war, not only against racism, but against all what the GIs called the chicken shit stuff, where they had to serve the officers, they had to salute them, they had to more or less obey everything, and they had no control of their lives. Whereas we saw our intervention as attempting to break the chain of command as part of potentially smashing the state. And there were even experiences I had that made me think at that time, although it wasn't, that I thought it was possible. I believed in my youth. Now, I would like to talk about a few of the experiences we had that probably some of you who have been involved in the GI movement know about, but which I participated in personally. The first one that was really of dramatic importance was a case we call the Fort Hood 43. This was a case about, it was right before the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago that, you know, was very famous because it was the demonstrations by what they call the yippies and the radical movement was suppressed severely by Mayor Daley's police force. However, there was, behind it all was the fear of the Johnson administration that demonstrations would spill over into the black community, which had had major rebellions in that year, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King in hundreds of cities in the United States. So they prepared to send military divisions into Chicago in order to have a backup to repress the black community should there be a rebellion. And one of these divisions was in Fort Hood, and of course it had a lot of black soldiers in it. And these were soldiers who come back from Vietnam, were fed up with the war, and were not happy about having to go to Chicago to suppress their brothers and sisters in Chicago. So on the night before they were about to be sent, about 60 of them held a meeting and said they wouldn't go and stuff like that. And in the morning they were arrested and charged with all sorts of, you know, disobeying orders and stuff like that. And lo and behold, one of the arrestees, one of the military police, was a member of the American Servicemen's Union, and he called us up, and we started organizing the legal defense, the legal and political defense for these GIs. So I wanted to talk about it because this is a very important example. It's both of the impact of the civilian civil rights and black liberation movement at that time on the GIs and on the consciousness of the GIs. Also the experience of the war and their unwillingness to put up with the crap handed down to them by the officers, and the possibility of intervening from the outside. It also showed in how the cases played out that the military was afraid of this movement, and they were not, at this particular case, they decided not to try to repress it with the full severity, like they did later on in the Presidio, in the cases where they gave everybody 20-year sentences and things like that. But in this case here, there was a little fiction that the lawyers came up with, because there was a car in the field where the guys were meeting, and sort of the defense was GIs were in the car and they couldn't hear the orders, so they couldn't disobey the orders. Okay. They couldn't all have been in the car, but they kept trying them 5 or 6 people at a time, and they usually managed to get at least 4 people in the car. So as they tried them, most of the guys got off, and those that did get sentences, the worst were more like 11 months, not 20 years. Anyway, that was one of the struggles. That was not considered a big deal to get an 11-month sentence at the time, even though that was punishment for these guys, and they lost benefits too. But most of them got off. The other struggle of importance that I was involved in took place in Hawaii, and it was in August of 1969. And I went there sort of as a replacement for Andy Stapp, who was a GI and who was the chairperson of the American Servicemen's Union, and because his daughter was being born around that time. And it turned out to be not just a regular, it was Nagasaki Day, August the 9th. There was a demonstration of the anti-war movement. But as a special thing happened, some of the GIs on the island, and there were over 200,000 GIs on the island, Marines, naval, Pearl Harbor is there, of course, so there was a large naval base, there were Marine bases, and there was Wickham, was the Army base, I think. There was an Air Force base there. And some of the Air Force guys decided that they would go AWOL and seek refuge in this church called the Church of the Crossroads. Well, it started out with one or two guys taking refuge, but by the end of the 3 or 4 days I was there, it had already grown to about 7 or 8 people. They were getting donations from the Marine base. Marines would drive over with food to, with meat to give to the people who were staying in the church. And it developed into a big struggle. This was August 1969. It was just about at the high point of the U.S. troop count in Vietnam, over 500,000 troops. And it actually was at that time that this was the time when I was hoping we would bring down the entire army, because not only was this going on at the church, but at Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station there was a rebellion of black GIs. And so you just got the feeling that everything was coming apart for them. And they must have gotten the feeling too, because the Nixon administration at that time began reducing the number of troops in Vietnam. And from that point on, it kept going down. And they did all sorts of things in the army, like as soon as guys got back into the United States, even if they had 3 or 4 months left on there to serve, they would let them out early. They would no longer make them shave their mustaches. They would let them let their hair grow a little bit long. They were really afraid of what was going on, and that they, meaning the Pentagon brass, and this guy Heino wrote about it at the time, that they worried about the actual collapse of the military. They worried about what I was hoping for. And neither of us were correct in that it actually took place, but the potential was there. That struggle in Hawaii, how it came out, after a few weeks, there were about, I think, as many as 17 GIs were in there. There's a book that Staunton Rinn wrote that has a chapter on it that I think is based on an article I did that talks about it. There's the military managed, well, what happened, I think, is that the movement out there, the anti-war movement, sort of had a tiger by the tail and was afraid to keep pushing it to the limit. So they did not want to attract any more GIs. They felt they couldn't handle it inside the church. And the military, instead of trying to go in and crush it by sending police in after it, just sort of waited it out until it had enough internal problems that when they did go in, they were able to arrest the people there. And there wasn't severe repression against the GIs at the time. That was, as I said, they had sort of made this decision sometime at 69, 70, while at the same time, over in Vietnam, the GIs who were rebellious were fragging officers. That is, they were rolling fragmentation grenades into their tent and killing them in order not to get dragged into battle or to protest against racism. Anyway, the one other story I want to bring up just very quickly is something that Max was involved in, because, I mean, most of you and somebody else here, I'm sure, will talk about what he did in Paris in 1967 and 68, and I guess 69 also, but he sent some of the GIs who had taken refuge in Paris back to the United States, who wanted to in, especially Terry Klug is the one I'm talking about, and he was arrested and brought to Fort Dix in New Jersey. And while in the military jail, in the I was going to say brig, but that's in the Navy, in the stockade in at Fort Dix, there was a rebellion. So there, in this sort of state within a state, the prison within the military, there was a rebellion of the soldiers who were prisoners in the stockade. And of course, Terry was singled out as a leader. During that rebellion, part of the stockade burned down, actually. And so there was another case, Fort Dix 38, of being charged. And what was interesting here was that they could not convict them, because either all the GIs who were there everyone refused to testify against anyone else. Most out of conviction and determination in the struggle. And for those where that wasn't the case, it was out of fear of retaliation from the other GIs. Like in any struggle, force is used on both sides. But in this struggle, our side was able to win, even under the conditions of being in a prison inside the military. And Terry, he did do time on his original sentence of desertion. He got out of military prison in the late summer of 1970 and began as organizing for the American Servicemen's Union. So those were the three cases that were important events. At least two of them are reflected in the movie Sir No Sir, if you've seen that. And I'm sure most of the people who are involved in the movement know of these cases very well. And we were involved in both the legal and the political defense of the GIs at the time, and in pushing forward the idea of organizing and the idea of breaking the chain of command, because the military is the main element of the state that keeps the capitalist class in control. And not that they don't rely also on a lot of ideological control, and their control of the media, which all of us are also very aware of. But we're talking about the military now, and that's the state apparatus. And I bring this up because those of you who know Max's work and the book that he wrote with Dave Courtwright know that they sort of, as I understand it, play around with the idea that the rebellion in the military is carried out by the level of troops differently depending on the development of the country. That is to say, in the imperialist countries, it's the rank and file troops who are the most rebellious. In a poorer country amongst them, say like in Portugal, there was a rebellion of the captains, of the lower ranking officers. And in a poor country like Ethiopia, there was a rebellion of the higher officers, the colonels, the generals in Egypt. However, in the long run, it's the rank and file soldiers who are closely identified with the working class, and in poorer countries in the peasantry of the country. And although they have privileges as soldiers, if there is a real revolutionary movement, it will have a tremendous pull upon the troops. And this happened, the latest that this happened that I know of is in Egypt, where there has been a mass revolution, but where the military structure of the old state and the old regime is still in control. And the higher officers are not only high officers and have privileges because of that, they are also very much entrepreneurs, because the army runs a lot of, about 40% of the business in Egypt. So they are capitalists and generals, and they share some of this with some of the other high-ranking officers. And right now, there is a struggle between, in fact, not even to overturn class relations in Egypt, but just to set up a democracy, a bourgeois democracy, a capitalist democracy. It appears necessary to have to crush the army, that is to break up the army in order to push it aside to get the rule. How could this be done, when they have all the arms, even if the masses are either with the democratic movement or with the Muslim Brotherhood. But one way is the military is not a monolith. And in fact, in April of 2011, while there was a demonstration of 500,000 people in Tahrir Square in Egypt, there was a battalion from a battalion of troops in Suez. About 150 troops came and joined the demonstration. And a bunch of them were junior officers in uniform, and they were brought on stage, and the crowd, of course, went wild to see them on the stage, because they believe the army and the people are one hand. But it was these lower-ranking officers who were identifying with the revolutionary movement. They were severely punished. In fact, what happened that day so frightened the police and the military and the political police that they decided immediately to charge the crowd, to disperse them, to arrest the officers, and they actually killed 2 of the junior officers and 19 civilians that night. It was April 8th, 9th, 2011 in Cairo Square. I noticed because I've just been translating a book from French to English, a book by a journalist, an Algerian French journalist who was in Tahrir Square at that time and was writing descriptive journalism about the development of the revolution there. And it's just another example of the importance of considering the army not as a monolith. It is definitely part of the state that defends the class interests of the rulers, the military. But it's not a monolith, and part of breaking it and pushing it aside is to win over sections of the military, especially the lower-ranking, the troops, and perhaps some of the junior officers, depending on the situation. Now, back to the drones. Can we stop it a minute?
Sorry.
Well, I'm running out of time now, so I just want to say goodbye to, say hello and goodbye to Vivian and all of Max's friends and everybody else in the GI movement out there, and say that the resistance continues. Today, by the way, is Pride Day in New York, and I'll be going out there with a rainbow flag and with a sign that says "Free Bradley Manning." I think your John Pilger was right that that was a more important issue perhaps than gay marriage, but why not have both? Free Bradley Manning and the right to gay marriage too. Thank you very much.